You ever spend years pouring your heart into something, only to have someone treat it like it meant nothing? That was me. I'd spent most of my life chasing flavors, learning how to turn plain ingredients into something that made people close their eyes and smile. Cooking wasn't just a hobby to me. It was my way of breathing, my way of remembering where I came from. But to my stepfather, it was all just a joke. He'd snicker whenever I talked about a new recipe, calling it playing kitchen, while bragging to anyone who would listen about my sister Brittany's fancy accounting job. At Brittany's wedding, he didn't just ignore me, he humiliated me. Right there in front of everyone, he tossed a pile of dirty plates into my hands and said, "Keep busy, kid." Guests laughed awkwardly, but I just stood there frozen. He wanted to make me feel small, like I didn't belong, but what he didn't expect was me flipping his plan upside down, turning that moment into something he'd never forget. Ever been embarrassed so badly that you swore you'd never let it happen again? That was my turning point. Stick around, because you're about to hear how I made him regret every word he said. I'm Ashley Miller, 24 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. My love for cooking started early, back when I was just a kid sneaking extra spices into my mom's meatloaf and pretending I was a TV chef. My dad used to laugh and say, "Ash, you've got a gift. Never lose it." Cooking was our thing. When he passed away suddenly when I was 10, that kitchen became my world. Every meal I made felt like keeping a piece of him alive. Then Mom remarried Frank Sullivan, a loud, pushy salesman who thought he could fix everything by barking orders. He strutted through our house like he'd built it himself, always wearing those cheap suits and fake confidence. Mom, Diane, fell for his big talk, but I saw the truth early. He wasn't a dad. He was a control freak who liked making people feel small. Brittany, my older sister, loved him right away. She was already Mom's favorite, and Frank made her his too. She had straight A's, perfect hair, and now a stable job as an accountant, his kind of real career. Frank used to beam at her across the dinner table saying, "You're going places, kid," while I sat quietly pushing peas around my plate, wishing I was invisible. When I was little, cooking was joy. Dad and I would flip pancakes on Sunday mornings, laughing when the batter splattered. After he was gone, it became my comfort. By high school, I was teaching myself everything, watching cooking videos, learning sauces, reductions, and plating. I started bringing my dishes to potlucks and school events, spicy shrimp tacos, lavender cupcakes, and people loved them. My culinary teacher, Mrs. Larson, told me I had talent and got me small catering jobs, $50 here and there. But to me, it was gold. It meant I was good at something. Frank never cared. He called my work playing house, said I should follow Brittany's example and get a real job. Mom never defended me. She just smiled weakly, afraid to upset him. I'll never forget her birthday dinner. I made her a 3-course meal, roasted chicken with herb sauce, garlic mashed potatoes, and a chocolate tart. Frank took one bite and said, "Not bad for a kid's project," then turned to toast Brittany's new promotion. My meal was forgotten in seconds. That was my life. Brittany in the spotlight, me in the shadows. Things hit a new low when Brittany got engaged to Greg Harper, a quiet software engineer with kind eyes and a steady paycheck. Greg was nice enough. He tried my food once and said it was restaurant level, which meant the world to me. But Frank? He saw the wedding as his big stage. He bragged about paying for everything, pushing for a lavish country club venue with chandeliers and waiters in bow ties. It wasn't about love or family. It was about showing off. Mom went along, smiling through every decision. Brittany was swept up in the details. The dress, the flowers, the guest list. I was barely included. When I offered to help with the food, to design a dessert table or even talk to the caterers, Frank cut me off. "We're not serving your experiments," he sneered from his recliner. "This is Brittany's day, not your kitchen fantasy." Then he tossed me a list of chores, tablecloths, RSVPs, errands. "Be useful," he said. Mom looked away. Brittany bit her lip but said nothing. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. You can't argue with someone who lives to crush your spirit. A month before the wedding, during dinner, Frank proudly laid out everyone's roles. Brittany and Greg were the stars. Mom handled flowers. Then he slid a clipboard toward me with that cruel grin I'd grown to hate. "Cleanup crew," he said. Keep the tables tidy, clear plates, useful stuff. My heart sank. Frank, I could help in the kitchen, I said quietly. Maybe prepare something special. But he cut me off with a mocking laugh. Kitchen's for the pros, kid. You stick to the plates. Brittany looked down. Mom busied herself collecting dishes. Even Greg looked uncomfortable. But no one said a word. I nodded, swallowing my pride like I always did. That night, I called my best friend, Tina Brooks. She's the kind of friend who never sugarcoats. When I told her about Frank and the cleanup job, she groaned. He's a jerk, Ash. You're a damn good cook. Don't let him box you in. I laughed bitterly. What do you want me to do? Sneak a cake into the wedding? She paused, then said softly, Maybe you should show them who you really are. That sentence hit me like a spark. The days ticked by. Every time I saw Frank, his smug grin made my stomach knot tighter. He'd pat Brittany's shoulder and say, This wedding's gonna be perfect thanks to my girl, then glance at me with that smirk. Just keep those tables clear, Ashley. His words echoed in my head every night. I didn't know how, but I knew one thing. If I got the chance, I'd prove I was more than the girl stuck cleaning up everyone else's mess. The morning of Brittany's wedding came bright and clear, like the world itself was mocking me. I woke up early, pulling on the black slacks and plain white shirt Frank had picked out for the cleanup crew. I'd worked so hard for years. Late nights, endless recipes, and now I was being treated like hired help. When I got to the country club, the place looked like something out of a movie. White roses everywhere, polished silver, and sunlight pouring through crystal chandeliers. Guests started arriving in sleek suits and glittering dresses, laughing, sipping champagne. I spotted Mom near the flowers, already fussing over details, and Brittany glowing in her lace gown surrounded by bridesmaids. She looked happy, radiant. When she caught my eye, she smiled and waved, but before I could respond, I smelled that cheap cologne that always warned me he was near. Frank. He appeared behind me, smirking like the devil himself. Tables don't clear themselves, Ashley, he said loud enough for a few people to hear. Don't even think about playing chef here. Just do your job. His words hit hard. My cheeks burned as guests glanced my way. I forced a smile, grabbed a tray, and started collecting glasses, keeping my head down. Frank strutted across the room like he owned the place, slapping Greg's dad on the back, laughing too loud, acting like he was responsible for everything. Every time I walked past, he tossed out another jab. Pick up the pace, kid. Try not to break anything. It wasn't just about chores. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted the world to see me as less. Brittany was busy posing for photos, lost in her perfect day. Mom saw everything but just looked away, rearranging napkins like it was her life's mission. I kept moving, stacking dishes, and biting my tongue, feeling smaller with every trip to the kitchen. By the time the ceremony started, I was stuck in the back watching Brittany glide down the aisle on Frank's arm. He was all puffed up, grinning like he'd raised her himself. Greg looked happy, and the crowd clapped when they kissed, but I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the stack of plates waiting for meet the reception. After the vows, guests headed to the banquet hall, chatting and sipping champagne while I slipped into the crowd to start clearing. The tables were a mess, half-eaten appetizers, spilled wine, and I felt eyes on me as I worked. A woman in a sparkly dress whispered to her friend, "Is she staff?" I wanted to disappear. Then Tina showed up, slipping through the guests in her bartender gear, her ponytail bouncing. She'd gotten a gig, pouring drinks for the wedding, her way of crashing without crashing. She pulled me aside near the dessert table out of Frank's sight and handed me a soda. "You okay, Ash?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "You look like you're about to snap." I told her about Frank's comments, how he'd made sure everyone knew I was just the cleanup girl. "He's a piece of work," she said, shaking her head. "But you're not this, Ash. You're a chef. Don't let him win." I shrugged, feeling the weight of the tray in my hands. "What can I do? Serve a 5-course meal from the dish pit?" Tina grinned, a spark in her eyes. "Maybe not that, but don't count yourself out yet." Her words lingered as I went back to work, dodging guests and stacking plates. Around 6, as the reception kicked into gear, I overheard the catering manager in a panic near the kitchen. "The bakery screwed us," he hissed into his phone. "No wedding cake, nothing. We're done for." My pulse spiked. No cake for Brittany's wedding. I'd seen the order. A 3-tier vanilla with buttercream meant to be the centerpiece. Without it, the night Woodbaum and Frank would hear about it. I hesitated, then followed the manager, catching him by the kitchen entrance. "I can make a cake," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He stared his tie, crooked from stress. "You kid, we need a professional," I pushed back. "I've catered weddings, smaller ones. I know what I'm doing. Give me a shot." He wasn't convinced, but he was desperate. So he pointed to the kitchen. "You've got 2 hours. Don't screw this up." I nodded, my heart racing, and stepped inside. That's when Frank caught me, his face darkening as he blocked the door. "What the hell are you doing?" he snapped. "Get back to the tables." I stood my ground, gripping the counter behind me. "They need a cake, Frank. I can save this." He laughed a cold cutting sound. "You save Brittany's wedding. Stick to the plates, Ashley. You're out of your league." His words stung, but they also lit a fire. I'd spent years taking his crap shrinking to fit his idea of me. Not today. I turned to the manager, who was still on the phone, and said, "I'm doing this." He waved me in, too stressed to argue. Frank stormed off, muttering about kids these days. But I didn't care. The kitchen was chaos cooks, shouting pans clanging. I scanned the supplies. Flour, sugar, eggs, vanilla, and berries in the fridge. Not ideal, but I could work with it. I'd made cakes before. Nothing this big, but I knew the drill. Tina poked her head in, grinning like she'd bet on me. "Kick-ass, Ash," she said, tossing me an apron. "Show that jerk what you've got." I started mixing batter my hands, moving on autopilot while my mind raced. This wasn't just about a cake. It was about proving I wasn't the nobody Frank thought I was. Every time I doubted myself, wondering if I'd crash and burn, I heard his voice. "Out of your league." It pissed me off enough to keep going. I whipped up a vanilla sponge, adding a touch of almond for depth, and prepped a buttercream frosting. The berries would be a filling. Maybe a quick jam if I had time. I glanced at the clock. 90 minutes left. My stomach churned, but there was no backing out now. As I poured batter into pans, ignoring the sweat on my forehead, I thought about Brittany. Would she hate me for stepping in, or would she get it? I didn't know. But I couldn't let her day fall apart. And Frank, he'd made this personal. If I pulled this off, he'd have to eat his words. Smug grin and all. I slid the pans into the oven, praying they'd bake evenly, and started on the jam. The kitchen felt like a battlefield. But for the first time that day, I wasn't just clearing plates. I was fighting for myself. The kitchen was a war zone. Cooks yelling over sizzling pans, waiters darting in and out, and me, Ashley Miller, standing at a cluttered counter with 90 minutes to save Brittany's wedding. No wedding cake. That was a disaster, especially with Frank out there acting like he'd planned the perfect day. I'd promised the catering manager a 3-tier cake, and now staring at sacks of flour and a fridge with some berries I had to deliver. My hands shook as I grabbed a mixing bowl, but Frank's last jab, "You save Brittany's wedding," kept me moving. This wasn't just about a cake. It was about shutting him up for good. I started with the batter, cracking eggs and measuring sugar. While the oven preheated, vanilla sponge was the safest bet. Simple but elegant if I nailed it. I added a splash of almond extract for depth, something I'd learned from a catering gig last year. The kitchen clock ticked like a bomb, and sweat beaded on my neck. I'd made cakes before, dozens for birthdays and small events, but never under this kind of pressure. Never with a room full of guests waiting or a stepfather betting on me to fail. I whisked the batter until it was smooth, ignoring the chaos around me, and poured it into 3 mismatched pans I'd scred from the supply rack. While the cakes baked, I tackled the frosting. Buttercream was my go-to, rich and forgiving. I grabbed butter from the cooler and started creaming it with powdered sugar, adding vanilla and a pinch of salt to cut the sweetness. The berries in the fridge, strawberries and raspberries, would make a quick jam for the filling. I tossed them into a pot with sugar and lemon juice stirring over a burner, while keeping an eye on the oven. The smell of baking sponge and simmering fruit filled the air, grounding me despite the nerves. I could do this. I had to. About 20 minutes in, while I was straining the jam, a woman in a sleek blazer poked her head into the kitchen. She had sharp eyes and a notepad looking out of place among the sweaty cooks. "You the one making the cake?" she asked, her voice crisp but curious. I nodded, wiping my hands on my apron. "I'm Lydia Carson," she said, stepping closer. "Food critic?" "Heard the bakery flaked. What's your plan?" My stomach dropped. "A critic here," I stammered. saying I was whipping up a vanilla cake with berry filling and buttercream. She raised an eyebrow, scribbling something down. Ambitious for a last-minute fix. I'll be watching. She left before I could respond, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Lydia's visit rattled me, but it also lit a spark. If a food critic was watching, I couldn't half-ass this. I checked the cakes golden and risen perfectly and pulled them out to cool. The jam was ready thick and tangy, so I set it aside and finished the buttercream, beating it until it was fluffy. Time was slipping. 45 minutes left. I started assembling, leveling the cakes with a knife and spreading jam between layers. The buttercream went on neck smooth, and even no crumbs in sight. I'd found some edible flowers in the fridge, white and delicate, so I saved them for decoration. It wasn't the fancy tiered masterpiece Brittany had ordered, but it was mine, and it was damn good. Tina ducked in her bartender vest, splattered with grenadine, and gave me a thumbs up. "You're killing it, Ash," she said, grabbing a spoon to taste the leftover jam. "This is going to blow their minds." I laughed, nervous but grateful, and asked her to keep an eye on the dining room. "Is Frank still out there acting like a big shot?" I asked. She rolled her eyes. "Yep, telling everyone how his girl Brittany pulled off the perfect wedding." Her words stung, but they pushed me harder. This cake wasn't just for Brittany or the guests. It was for me to prove I wasn't the nobody Frank thought. With 10 minutes to spare, I finished the cake, stacking the tiers carefully and piping simple swirls around the edges. The eatable flowers went on top, arranged in a loose crown that looked effortless, but took every ounce of focus I had. I stepped back, heart pounding, and took it in 3 tiers of vanilla sponge layered with ruby red jam and creamy frosting topped with flowers that caught the light. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful. The catering manager burst in his face. "Less panicked now." "Ready?" he asked. I nodded, grabbing the cart to wheel it out. "Let's do this," I said, my voice steady despite the butterflies. The banquet hall was buzzing guests, laughing glasses, clinking music, humming in the background. I pushed the cart through the crowd, feeling every eye turn my way. The manager led me to the center table where Brittany and Greg sat surrounded by family. I caught Frank's face first, his smirk fading as she saw the cake. Brittany gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Greg leaned forward, grinning like a kid. The room went quiet, conversations trailing off as I stopped the cart and stepped back. The manager cleared his throat, announcing, "Ladies and gentlemen, the wedding cake courtesy of Ashley Miller." A ripple of murmurs spread, then applause, loud and warm. Guests stood craning to see the cake, some pulling out phones to snap pictures. Brittany jumped up her dress, swishing, and hugged me, whispering, "Ash, it's gorgeous." Greg clapped my shoulder, saying, "You saved the day." I managed to smile, my chest tight with relief. But my eyes locked on Frank. He stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his smug grin gone. For the first time, he had nothing to say. I felt a rush, part victory, part defiance, like I'd finally stepped out of his shadow. Lydia Carson was through the crowd, her blazer catching the light. She stopped in front of the cake, studying it like a painting. "Impressive," she said, her voice carrying over the chatter. "Vanilla with almond notes, berry filling, and those flowers, a bold choice under pressure. This isn't just a cake. It's a statement." The guests clapped again louder now, and Lydia turned to me. "You're not a professional, are you?" she asked. I shook my head, admitting I was self-taught, just doing catering gigs. She smiled, handing me her card. "We'll talk later. Talent like this doesn't stay hidden." The room erupted, cheers, mixing with applause as Brittany and Greg cut the first slice. Guests lined up, raving about the cake's flavor, the creamy frosting, the tart jam. A man in a suit, some friend of Greg's dad, asked if I did private events, slipping me his number. Another woman, maybe a local business owner, wanted to know my rates. I nodded, taking it all in, but my mind was spinning. I'd come here to clear plates to be invisible. Now I was the one they couldn't stop talking about. Tina caught me by the bar, grinning ear to ear. "Told you you'd kick ass," she said, pouring me amok-tail. Frank's face. "Worth every second." I glanced over. He was by the dessert table talking to Mom, but stealing looks at me. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by something sour like he'd bitten into a lemon. Mom was watching too, her expression softer, almost proud, but she didn't come over. Brittany was back at her table laughing with Greg, but she kept glancing my way like she was seeing me for the first time. I should have been on top of the world, but a knot twisted in my gut. Frank wasn't done. I knew him too well. He'd hated being upstaged, and I'd just stolen his perfect little show. As the music picked up and guests started dancing, I saw him heading toward me, his face set like a storm cloud. I braced myself, knowing whatever came next wouldn't be pretty. He'd made this personal from the start, and now I'd turned his game against him. The fight wasn't over. The banquet hall buzzed with chatter as the last slice of my wedding cake disappeared from the dessert table. Guests were still raving, snapping photos of the 3-tier masterpiece I'd thrown together in 2 hours. I stood by the kitchen entrance apron, smeared with buttercream, watching people I didn't even know raise their glasses to Brittany and Greg. For a moment, I felt like I'd done something real. Not just saved the day, but proved I was more than Frank's cleanup girl. Then I saw him storming toward me, his face red and his jaw tight. Frank didn't look smug anymore. He looked pissed. He grabbed my arm, pulling me into a side room where the catering staff stored linens. "What the hell was that stunt?" he hissed, keeping his voice low so Noon outside would hear. "You think you can hijack Brittany's wedding with your little cooking show?" His words hit hard, each one meant to cut me down like they always had. I yanked my arm free, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "I didn't hijack anything, Frank. There was no cake. Someone had to step up. I saved your precious wedding," he scoffed, leaning in close enough that I could smell his stale coffee breath. "Saved it. You made it about. You always got to be the center of attention, huh?" I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. For years, I'd swallowed his jabs, his sneers about my cooking, his praise for Brittany, while I sat there invisible. Not this time. "You're wrong," I said, locking eyes with him. "You wanted McLaren plates to keep me small, but I'm not your punching bag. I'm a chef, and I just proved it to everyone out there." Frank's mouth twitched like he wanted to laugh but couldn't. Before he could fire back, the door swung open and Brittany stood there still in her wedding dress. Her face a mix of confusion and something else I couldn't read. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing between us. Frank straightened up, plastering on that fake smile he used for guests. "Nothing, honey. Just telling Ashley she overstepped." Brittany frowned, her eyes landing on me. I braced myself, expecting her to side with him like always, but she stepped closer, her voice firm. "Overstepped, Frank. She saved my wedding. That cake was incredible. Everyone's talking about it." Frank blinked, caught off guard. "It's your day, Brittany," he said softer now. "She shouldn't be stealing your spotlight." Brittany shook her head, her veil catching the light. "She didn't steal anything. She made it better. You should be proud of her." I stood frozen, hardly believing what I'd heard. Brittany had never stood up for me. Not like this. Frank's smile faltered, his control slipping as Brittany's words hung in the air. Before I could say anything, Lydia Carson, the food critic who'd praised my cake, walked in, her sharp gray eyes scanning the room. "There you are, Ashley," she said, her tone warm but direct. "I've been looking for you." Frank's eyebrows shot up. He clearly knew who she was. Lydia didn't even glance at him. She focused on me. That cake was extraordinary. Perfectly balanced flavors. Flawless execution. "I run a restaurant group in New York. We're opening a new spot in Manhattan. Fine dining, modern American. I want you on the team." My jaw dropped. I couldn't speak for a second. New York, a real restaurant. "I am just starting out," I stammered, feeling the weight of her offer. Lydia smiled, handing me a business card. "You're not just anything. Call me next week. We'll talk details." She turned to Brittany, nodding approvingly. "Your sister's got serious talent. You must be proud." Brittany nodded, her eyes soft. "I am." Frank stood there silent for once, like he'd been punched in the gut. Lydia left and I slipped the card into my pocket, my hands shaking. The door hadn't even closed when another guest approached a guy in a tailored suit who introduced himself as Tom Delaney, owner of a local bistro called the Rustic Spoon. "Heard about your cake?" he said, shaking my hand. "I need a new pastry chef, someone with your creativity. You free to meet next week?" I nodded, still reeling, mumbling something about my schedule. As he walked away, I caught Mom standing by the doorway, watching quietly. She hadn't said a word during the whole exchange, but her eyes weren't avoiding me anymore. She stepped forward, her voice low. "Ashley, that was really something. I didn't know you could do that. It wasn't much, but from Mom it was huge." Frank cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Well," he said, forcing a chuckle, "guess you got lucky out there, kid." I looked at him, seeing the cracks in his usual swagger. "It wasn't luck," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "It was me doing what I'm good at." He didn't respond, just adjusted his tie and walked out, muttering about checking on the guests. Brittany touched my arm, her smile small but real. "I meant what I said, Ash. That cake, it was amazing. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. For the first time, I felt like she saw me not just as her kid's sister, but as someone who mattered. The rest of their reception was a blur. Guests kept coming up asking about the cake, complimenting the flavors. A woman who ran a catering company slipped me her card, saying she'd love to collaborate. Greg found me by the bar, grinning as he clapped me on the shoulder. "You killed it, Ashley. Brittany's over the moon about that cake." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't expected. Even the catering manager who doubted me gave me a nod, saying, "You pulled off a miracle, kid." I didn't feel like a kid anymore. As the night wound down, I stepped outside for air, leaning against the patio railing. The stars were out bright against the Ohio sky, and I let myself breathe. I'd walked into this wedding expecting to be invisible, hauling plates while Frank lorded over everything. Instead, I'd turned it around. Not just for Brittany's day, but for me. Lydia's card burned a hole in my pocket. New York felt like a dream, but it was real. Mom's words echoed, too tentative but honest. And Brittany. She'd stood up for me, something I never thought I'd see. I wasn't naive. Frank wouldn't change overnight. He'd probably spin this to his buddies' act like he'd always known I had potential. But it didn't matter. I'd seen what I could do, what I was worth, and no one could take that away. The question now wasn't whether I could make it as a chef. It was where I'd go next, and what I'd do with the chance I'd fought for. 3 weeks after Brittany's wedding, I stood in my tiny Columbus apartment boxes, packed and labeled, ready to leave Ohio behind. Lydia Carson's business card sat on my kitchen counter, worn from how many times I'd held it. Her offer wasn't just a job. It was a ticket to New York, a chance to work in a real kitchen to be a chef, not the girl Frank Sullivan thought belonged in the dish pit. I'd called her the Monday after the wedding, my hands shaking as I dialed. "We start training in a month," she'd said, her voice crisp but kind. "Be ready to work hard, Ashley." I was ready more than I'd ever been. Leaving wasn't easy. Columbus was all I'd known, my dad's old house, the diner, where Tina and I grabbed late-night fries, the community college where I'd taken my first culinary class. But staying meant living under Frank's shadow, his sneers and his rules. I couldn't do it anymore. The wedding had changed me, not just because of the cake or Lydia's offer, but because I'd finally seen my own worth. Frank could call it a stunt all he wanted. I knew what I'd done. I'd turned his attempt to humiliate me into the moment that set me free. Frank didn't take it well. A few days after the wedding, he cornered me at Mom's house where I'd stopped to drop off some borrowed cookware. He was in his usual spot, sprawled in his recliner, a beer in hand, but his grin was gone. "Heard you're running off to New York," he said, his tone half mocking, half bitter. "Think you're a big shot now?" I set the pans on the counter, keeping my back straight. "I'm not running, Frank. I'm starting my life something you never thought I could do." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Don't get cocky, kid. You got lucky with that cake. Real world's gonna chew you up." I looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who needed to put me down to feel big. "Maybe," I said, "but that's my call, not yours." He tried to spin it later, bragging to his golf buddies about my stepdaughter, the chef, like he'd been in my corner all along. I heard about it from Mom, who mentioned it over coffee one morning, her voice hesitant. "Frank's proud in his way," she said, stirring her mug. I didn't buy it. Frank wasn't proud. He was scrambling to save face after I'd proved him wrong. I let it go, nodding to keep the peace. Mom was trying, and that was something. Before I left her house that day, she pulled out a worn leather notebook, yellowed pages filled with handwritten recipes. "These were your grandma's," she said, pressing it into my hands. "She loved cooking like you. You remind me of her, Ashley." Her eyes were soft, almost teary, and I hugged her, feeling a warmth I hadn't in years. Brittany was different, too. She and Greg were back from their honeymoon a week in Hawaii when she called me out of the blue. "Can we meet?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. We grabbed lunch at a taco place near her office, her in a blazer, me in my beat-up sneakers. She didn't beat around the bush. "I'm sorry, Ash. she said, pushing her plate aside. I didn't see how Frank treated you, how I let it happen. I was too wrapped up in my own stuff. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to brush it off, but her words hit deep. You stood up for me at the wedding, I said finally. That meant a lot. She smiled, a real smile, not the polite one she used to give. You're my sister. I want us to be better. We made a deal, weekly calls no matter how busy life got. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Tina threw me a going-away party at her bar, a dive joint with sticky floors and killer wings. She mixed me a mocktail, calling it the Ashley Special, and toasted to my new life. You're going to own New York, she said, her grin wide. And if Frank shows up, I'll pour dishwater in his beer. I laughed, picturing it, and hugged her tight. Tina had been my rock, pushing me to fight when I wanted to quit. I promised to fly her out once I got settled, maybe show her a real Manhattan kitchen. The day I left, Mom and Brittany drove me to the airport. Frank didn't come. Said he had a work thing, but I knew better. It was fine. I didn't need his goodbye. Mom held my hand at the gate, her grip tighter than usual. You'll do great, she said, her voice catching. Brittany handed me a small gift, a keychain shaped like a chef's hat. For luck, she said, and we hugged until the boarding call crackled over the speakers. As I walked to the plane, my carry-on bouncing behind me, I felt lighter than I had in years. New York was a whirlwind. I moved into Asho Box apartment in Brooklyn, shared with 2 roommates who ate my leftovers, and started training at Lydia's restaurant, the Saffron Room. The kitchen was intense chefs, barking orders, plates flying, but I loved it. Every dish was a chance to prove myself, to show I belonged. Lydia was tough but fair, pulling me aside one night to say my berry tart had promise. It wasn't a Rav, but from her it was gold. I kept Grandma's notebook on my nightstand, flipping through it when I needed a boost. Her scrolled recipe for lemon pound cake inspired my first menu item, a modern twist that got nods from the sous chef. A month in, I got a call from Brittany. She and Greg were visiting New York for a weekend. We met at a diner near Times Square, her laughing when I ordered a burger after weeks of fancy plates. She told me Frank was still talking about my big break, trying to take credit with his buddies. I rolled my eyes, but it didn't sting anymore. He could talk all he wanted. I was building something real. Brittany showed me pictures from the wedding, my cake front and center in half of them. You made my day, Ash, she said, her voice soft. I smiled, feeling the gap between us shrink a little more. Looking back, that wedding wasn't just Brittany's. It was the day I stopped letting Frank define me. I'd walked in expecting to be invisible, hauling plates while he played king. Instead, I'd turned his game against him, not out of spite, but because I knew who I was. Cooking wasn't a hobby or a kid's project. It was my life. I didn't need Frank's approval or anyone's to keep going. I'd fought for my place and won. If you've ever had tossed an up for what you love against someone who tried to shut you down, I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments. Your fight matters, and so do